Hi guys, Brian Latimer here. Today we're going to talk a little bit about winter fishing. This is one of the most interesting times of the year to fish around here in South Carolina, and for the most part, for the Southeast in general. We're finally starting to get some cooler temperatures. The water, even though we've had a really abnormal warm fall period, the latter part of the fall has been really warm. We're starting to get into a lot of the cooler weather. Some of our fish are finally starting to transition to the winter periods, and we're going to talk about some of the baits that I like to use the most during the winter time. Most of the baits that I'm going to talk about today are going to be primarily for clear water applications. It's really tough for me to put all of the baits for every cold water application in one basket and just give them to you like that. So I'm going to break it down into two specific categories. One is going to be for deep, clear water impoundments, like I have here at Lake Hartwell. These are going to be baits primarily for fishing deep and clear water lakes. The second category is going to be for stained water, shallow water lakes, grass lakes. It's a totally different bait selection that I like to use for cold water, shallow fishing. We'll talk about that in a different segment. Today we're primarily going to talk about the baits I like to use for wintertime fishing when it's cold. When we talk about wintertime fishing, primarily where I live, we're going to be talking about late November through the end of February, sometimes even the first part of March. That's typically when our fish are going to be in the winter patterns. And there's still a lot of deviation depending on what the environmental conditions are a particular year. A lot of times we have really mild winters, and there's been years where we've had very, very cold winters. And so far this year has been a very, very mild winter. A lot of times when we're thinking about wintertime fishing, we're primarily thinking about fishing deep, fishing 25, 30 foot deep. And a lot of times that is the case, but particularly where I live at, here in the upstate of South Carolina, we're going to have fish moving from all depths of the water column to the backs of the creeks all the way to the main lake. There's usually going to be some fish active. This time of the year is probably one of the prime times of the year to catch a lot of fish. You're going to catch a lot of fish in the wintertime. Our fish school up very well. They don't really care about cold water. We have northern strain largemouth bass, and they love cold weather. They're fishing deeper, fishing for the deeper bass. Our fish are going to be primarily feeding on threadfin shad this type of year. Hear a lot about the blueback herring, and they do feed on the blueback herring, but primarily the bulk of a bass's diet this time of the year is going to be threadfin shad. So I like a lot of smaller baits, and that's what I'm typically looking for. If I find the shad this time of the year, if I find the food, the forage in a creek, there is going to be fish there. There is no doubt. I always find fish where there's bait and vice versa. So there's a couple baits I like to use. When I'm fishing out there fishing deep, it's primarily going to be a vertical presentation. I use a lot of vertical presentations from December on. It's a prime time. These fish, when the water gets cold, it gets to that 46, 47 degree mark. Those fish don't really get really mobile. They really set into place. They don't really move a lot. So one of the proven winners that works all the time, has worked since I was a kid back in the 80s. I watched my dad catch them on this fish when I was a little kid, on this bait when I was a little kid. It's 2016 and the bait still does it. It's just a hunk of lead, just a old ½ ounce or 1 ounce jigging spoon. White is a good color. There's another color I like to use that has a white belly with sort of like a teal back on it. That's a great color to use. I'm not really particular about colors. I'll use, shad patterns, whites and blues. That's pretty much all I use, and it works really well when I'm going to be looking for birds. Seagulls really bird dog the fish this time of year. So if I see some seagulls working, what happens is the fish push the bait up to the surface. They're feeding on bait, and they push that bait up to the surface. Well, you have seagulls, they're just circling around these creeks, and they're just looking for where fish have pushed up that bait. They can see the clouds of bait, and they come in and dive on it. So anytime I see that bird activity, I know, number one, there's bait there. And number two, if there's bait there, there's fish there. And the best way to target those fish is to get right on top of them, get down in the ditch, over the timber lines, over the brush piles, or whatever the ditch, the structure is that I'm fishing, and drop vertically right down on top of them with a jigging spoon. It produces all the time. It's a great bait. It flutters down like a dying bait fish, and I can get it right down to the fish really quickly. So it's a great way to get a reaction bite. This is sort of the reaction bite of the vertical presentations. We'll talk about a different vertical presentation that I like as well that works really good, but number one is going to be the jigging spoon. I've been doing a lot of vertical fishing here lately, and I've been using a drop shot, and it's a real simple setup. All I use is a small 1/4 ounce tungsten drop shot weight, 6-pound test line, a number 1 owner drop shot hook, and this is a 3.75 inch Z-Man Fishing Streaks, and that's just a shad type imitator. That's also a great bait to use. A lot of times they won't hit the jigging spoon. Jigging spoons are really aggressive if you want to think about it this way. A jigging spoon would be a crankbait, and this would be the shaky head. This would be when I really need to finesse on a real bluebird day like we have here today. It's really calm. There's not a lot of wind blowing. A lot of times you have to approach those fish that are deeper with a finesse presentation. And this, the streaks or the drop shot. I won't always use the streaks, but the streaks is just a perfect profile of a little small threadfin shad. That's what I'll use when I'm dropping down on them when I need to have a finesse presentation. So drop shot, you've seen it in just about every sequence that I've had on a tutorial, any type of seasonal fishing. The drop shot's always played, and it's even a more important player in the wintertime when I'm fishing for vertical fish right under the boat. Our third presentation, you guys have seen it. The classic was the one on it. Casey actually, he's really made the Blade Runner famous. We call it the Blade Runner, what we call it here at home. Some people call it the pony head. Some people call it a road runner. Some people call it an underspin, but here it is. We call it the Blade Runner here at home. This is just a 3/8 ounce Blade Runner pony head with a willow leaf blade on it. Just an underspin, 375 streaks, the same thing I'm using on my drop shot. Just throw it out. This is a little bit slower. I don't really like to fish this particular presentation, but it's one of those deals that works, and if you're fishing around here in these clear highland reservoirs, you better have it on your deck. So this is a bait that I use this time of year as well. It's great to fish timber lines. You just throw it out, fish those timber lines. 30-35 foot of water is where all our timber lines start on the Savannah River chain. You can get just right on the edge of those timber lines and let it just flutter right down the timber. And a lot of times, and especially in the morning, our fish feed really heavily on those threadfin shad and those blueback herring, and they're really active. They're suspended. They may be over 55, 60, 70 foot of water, but they're only in the top portion of the winter water column. And you just let this bait flutter down. They're really slow, and that's how you trigger the bites with it. It's a really slow presentation, not my favorite, but it works, and you got to have it around here. The Blade Runner, make sure you guys have it if you're fishing in the upstate of South Carolina during the winter time. No, another bait that I really like to use, this is another age-old bait. It's nothing groundbreaking at all. This is just a 3/8 swim bait. This particular bait is just a 3-inch diesel minnow. This is a great bait to use on a jig head, a 3/16 ounce jig head. It works. It doesn't matter what the water column is. A lot of times I'll just throw this bait out, even though it's a 3/16 ounce, and it sinks really slow. I'll just throw it out, let it cascade through a school of fish. It's a great way to catch fish that are suspended. You can see it's a really small swim bait. This is a great profile. Most of the time they're going to be feeding on really small shad, so it just fits the forage perfectly. I can use this on rocky banks. I can throw it around docks. A lot of times we tend to think in the wintertime a lot of fish go deep, and a lot of them do, but there's still a lot of big fish, and in my opinion, the biggest fish of the year are still going to stay shallow because they don't have time to get out there and chase around in deep water. So I like to fish shallow as well in the wintertime when it's really cold. But this bait is really versatile. I can fish it from 50, 60 foot deep, or I can fish it really shallow around docks, rocky banks. Bank transitions are really good times to fish a swim bait, and it's just, it works. It's one of those baits. There's nothing great about it. 3/16 ounce trout out jig head from Z-Man Fishing with a 3/8 diesel minnow. This is just a shad pattern color. These baits just work. They work all the time. It's a great, our fish school a lot. We have a lot of surface feeding in the wintertime, and this was a great bait to use when those fish are feeding on surface bait. They can be really finicky, and you can't use a bait that has a lot of action and displaces a lot of water. This has a really subtle kick to it, and it just fits the profile to a T. It's a great bait to use this time of the year. Anytime you're out there in the winter time, make sure you have your little small 3/8 jig head swim bait, and you're gonna catch a lot of fish on it. Just keeping with the theme, keeping it old school, the old bucktail. You know, the bucktail's really gotten a lot of press in the last 5 years because of the Tennessee River impoundments, but this is a bait that's really been a staple on the Savannah River chain for years. I can remember my dad fishing this in the 80s, 90s, all the way through. We really never stopped fishing this. It's one of those baits that doesn't do a lot. I don't even put a trailer on it or anything. I just use a straight up bucktail, and this is just a 3/8 ounce bucktail. Works great. When you don't need a lot of action, you need something really subtle when the water really dips really cold, 41, 42, 43 degrees. Those fish, they don't really like a lot of action. If you ever watch bait in the water when the water's really cool, they don't really have a lot of action. They really just kind of float through the water column. And that's what the bucktail does. It doesn't really have a lot of action to it. I don't like a lot of different colors in it. I don't try to match the hatches. Just use a simple white bucktail jig. No trailer, no nothing. You throw it out there, you can just very slowly reel it on the bottom. You can throw it out, let it cascade through a school of fish or through bait fish, and this bait always works. It's old school, but it still catches them, always has and always will. You've got to have a bucktail if you're fishing wintertime fish in a clear water environment. You know, even fishing in clear water this time of the year, I still like a little crankbait. When we really get a windy day, or we get really cloudy conditions, you'll be surprised how well a crankbait will produce for you, even in very, very gin clear water. So I'll always keep a small crankbait on deck. You know, shad wraps have been really a staple over the years. And I'll just fish bank transitions, just where the bank switches from sand to red clay, or from pebble rock to boulders, or vice versa. And just hit those transitions. And a lot of times, especially in clear water, your fish are feeding on sight. They're typically preying on their forage from sight. They see the bait coming through and then they attack it. So the bait doesn't necessarily have to be on the bottom. So don't be scared to throw a bait that dives 6-8 foot over, you know, 10, 12, 15 foot of water. I'm not really concerned about the bait hitting the bottom. A lot of times it's going to be a reaction bite, especially when it's windy outdoors and there's a good ripple on the surface. A lot of these crankbaits are going to catch you a lot of fish, get you a lot of reaction strikes this type of year. And another one that I'll follow up with is also the jerkbait. You know, the jerkbait's just a staple. This always works. I like particularly flat-sided jerkbaits because they displace a little bit more water, got a little bit more flash on them. And I'm typically going to throw these hard baits, the crankbait and the jerkbait, when we have windy conditions. We'll have those adverse conditions. It's raining outside, it's nasty, it's sleeting, snowing. Those are going to be the conditions where you're going to want to use these reaction baits. The fish just seem to react to them a lot better when there's adverse conditions, windy conditions, and really cloudy conditions. So the jerkbait's got to be on the deck. You got to have it during the winter time. Really cold periods of time of the year, you can throw that bait out there. Long pauses, and you're going to catch a lot of fish on it as well. That's primarily the baits that I like to use for cold water, clear fisheries. There's a totally different bait set that I like to use when I'm fishing shallow, stained lakes, and we'll talk about those in a different segment. But make sure you guys get out there, especially if you live on these clear water impoundments. When the weather's nasty in the wintertime, a lot of times you don't want to go. When it's raining, sleeting, snowing, the weather's just horrible. We have those northern strain bass and they don't care about it. Make sure you guys get out there. I promise you, you will love the reward that you're going to get from getting out there, fighting the elements, getting out there, throwing your jigging spoon, finding those fish, feeding on those seagulls. Pay attention to the surrounding environment. They're going to be the telltale sign. A lot of different things are going to bird dog you where the fish are, and this is the time of the year where you can catch a lot of fish and you can catch them really quickly. And a lot of times of the year, this is going to be the biggest fish of the year going to show up right now during the winter time.